Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today for our webinar on maximizing federal funding opportunities through a number of different federal funding legislations, bills that have been enacted under the Biden administration. So you still have a number of people coming in, but I think we're going to get things started with a poll. So I think we'll launch the poll as people continue to join us today. We'd like to know a little bit about our audience before we get started. So please answer these questions as you see them. And again, this is the second of 4 webinars that OPR, the Office of Planning and Research, is hosting throughout the month of March, presented by Whit O'Brien's, who we're very happy to have with us today. You can find the links for all of these trainings. Oh, here we're seeing that the poll has disappeared. So can we relaunch the poll? Looks like people are maybe having trouble answering the poll question. So sorry about that. I'm not sure if we can relaunch it. Okay, looks like it's starting to come in now. Hopefully people can see the poll questions. Great, so we can get an idea of who our audience is today. Thank you, thanks for that comment. So again, for these webinars that we're holding on federal grants throughout the month of March, you can find more information on the OPR website under the announcements page. You can find all the information there, links to registration. Thanks to everyone who filled out our pre-webinar survey as well. So the links are there as well on the OPR announcements page. Great, I'm seeing a lot of answers to our poll questions here. So we'll give it just another few seconds if you haven't filled out those questions yet. And great, I think we're almost all the way there. I think we could probably end the poll and see the results now. Great, so we have a great diversity of attendees here from across California and outside as well. A great mix of different organizations here represented, a lot of nonprofits, county, local governments, as well as some tribes, higher education, state governments, other types of organizations. Wonderful. As far as people applying for these different federal funding bills, again, a mix. More people have not yet applied or in the process of it. So this should be really relevant, hopefully very helpful for you as you prepare those applications. And, again, lots of different bills out there. Some people are not sure of which one they're interested in applying for. So hopefully this will give you some information to help that decision. And sort of a mix of confidence levels here, more people in the somewhat confidence about the abilities to secure funding through these funding bills. So, so thank you so much for filling that out. And so now we're going to get started a little bit. Before we jump into the presentation, I wanted to share a little bit of information on the federal resources available through the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, or OPR. You can find all of this information from the OPR websites, the homepage at opr.ca.gov under the tab for CEQA and federal grants. We'll go over and click the link for federal assistance, which will take you here to this page. I want to highlight these 3 different topics that you see here: applying for federal grants, federal grant resources, and the federal grant email list. So starting when you click on the applying for federal grants page link, that will take you to our portal, the Intergovernmental Review of Federal Grants website. This is where you'll go when you are applying for a federal grant that is subject to the Executive Order 12372 process. To provide your notice of application, you'll fill out the form on this page, attach a copy of your federal standard form 424, sort of the cover sheet for the application. And then once you submit here, then all registered elected officials will receive notice of your application, and they're provided the opportunity to provide comments. Anyone from the public can also view these notices on this website through the submissions tab, which also allows filtering. Next, we have federal grant resources page, tons of information. If you're just getting started in grants or more experienced, there should be something here to help you out. And most importantly, this is where the slides and recordings from today's webinar and all the webinars that we host will be posted under the OPR trainings heading. And finally, we have our federal grants email list, which is a weekly newsletter with the latest in federal funding opportunities, news, and events. Hopefully, many of you are already signed up for this, but if not, I will share the link to sign up for this weekly newsletter in the chat as well. It's a really great resource you won't find anywhere else. So again, hope you can sign up for that today. And with that, I will close. Here is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out. And again, before we get started with our presentation, just a quick disclaimer that the following presentation is not legal advice and does not necessarily represent the views of OPR, but is being provided here today as a service to the grants community. And so with that, I will turn things over to our presenters, Jason first, and Matt from Witt O'Brien's for this very exciting presentation. So thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Amy. And hello, everybody. Again, my name is Jason Misselbauer. I'm a director here at Witt O'Brien's. I have a background in nonprofit and state government, most recently with the state of Arizona in their centralized grants office within the governor's office. So today we're gonna be taking a look at all of the variety of funding that's available with current legislation, as Amy said, that includes some of the ARPA. It feels like we just passed the 2-year mark or the 2-year mark on ARPA, and it feels like that's old news. But we still have 4 more years of ARPA still to come. So at least 2 years to obligate and then 2 years to fully expend the funding. So our main focus will be IIJA, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, BIL. People use either one, they mean the same thing. And then the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the newest and probably the one that we we'll just tread lightly on, given that there's a lot of funding to be announced still with that one, but also not a whole lot of grant funding, which we'll talk about. And then once we're done with that, Matt's going to get into how to prepare and apply for funding, and thinking about your organization and thinking about the funding opportunity that you're looking at. And then lastly, the benefits of intergovernmental coordination. All right, next slide, please. Again, Jason Misselbauer. I'm joined here by Matt Hansen. I've worked under Matt for about 15 years. He led the office, the centralized grants office at the state of Arizona. And then I took over when he left for Witt O'Brien's, and Matt recruited me and I joined Witt O'Brien's about a year ago. Next slide. So a little bit about the BIL, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and or Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. First, we just passed the year mark in November. At that point, it's a $1.2 trillion funding bill. At that point, it still had, so after the year mark, it still had over $1 trillion yet to be announced and released. So even with the time pass from November to now, there is a ton of money, and that's something that we'll stress, or I'll stress throughout the slides that I'll present. There is a lot of funding yet to be distributed, released even. Really, all of this is about planning, preparing your application, maybe not for the current release announcement, but for, again, it's a 5-year plan. So you have plenty of time to plan and prepare and to apply. With the IRA, that's relatively new. It was the 16th of 2022 that it was released. Again, minimal grant funding in that. A lot of the funding there, the majority of the funding, is in the form of tax credits to businesses. There's roughly only about $69 million in grant, or $1 billion in grant funding, with only 37 billion of that, so just a little bit over half of that, for government units of government in that funding. So again, the other 32 billion of grants is going to the private sector. So again, the IRA is really about incentives, tax credits, et cetera. Next slide. So again, I had mentioned about it being the BIL, the IIJA being 1.2 trillion over 5 years. Looking at this slide, when I first looked at it and I was thinking about what to say, whenever I see formula grants, I always think of, that the state's the only one that's able to apply, or that it's a formulaic grant for the state. And while that's still true here, in some ways where the state is, there is components or formula grant funding for states, more of the formulas and more of the formulaic grants capture all units of government. You saw that in the energy efficiency and conservation block grant that was just released. And there's other formulaic grants where instead of it just being from the state, and maybe the state releases a grant program related to that formulaic funding, they're incorporating other additional units of government in the formulaic distribution. Additionally, the great thing about that formulaic funding and this administration is that they're making a requirement of pass-through funding, which we'll talk about in some of the next slides, but that within that, no longer can the state necessarily hold on to the funding or utilize it in a certain manner or degree. That now there's allocation, and some of it's very significant. The broadband funding or cybersecurity funding, where 80% needs to go out to local units of government. And then additional, we'll talk about some other funding opportunities where they have allocations in the preceding slides. And then the other 40% of that funding is competitive in nature. And even within that competitive piece, when you think of competitive, you might think that you're going, depending on the size of your entity, that you will be going against or judged against everybody. Well, the great thing that they've done, again, this administration has done around its equity planning, is making sure a lot of this funding, the competitive side, has set-asides for rural communities, typically those under 50,000 in population. Additionally, historically disadvantaged communities, areas of persistent poverty. So there's funding within those competitive programs that, it's a sort of a program within a program where, if you fit into one of those other boxes, that's where you're going to be applying through, or how you're going to be judged, instead of sort of everybody being evaluated against everybody else. Next slide, please. So here, I really want to hit on, again, I'm not going to read this slide, but the one that I want to hit on is that 38% of funding contains provisions that allow for expanded federal cost share arrangements. What that really means is, within this funding, there are those applications or programs that require a cost share, a match. However, again, if you there are waivers to that where the federal funder, because you're a rural community, or you're an area of persistent poverty or disadvantaged community, or your project is in one of those areas, your application project is in one of those areas, that the match component is waived for you. So it's really great to see, because sometimes that match can be a burden and can be a barrier to applying, coming up with the match. Next slide, please. Again, within the bipartisan infrastructure law, really just want to focus on here just to transportation. Transportation is the largest funding component, with over 50%, as you see there, bullet 2, $660 billion of funding is in the BIL, which is over 50%. Next slide. breaking that out a little bit into some of the bigger programs. And again, not knowing, you know, not knowing everybody's background, you know, typically when you think of transportation, or when I do, I always think of paving roads or new highways or whatever. And really, again, there's a ton of flexibility, a ton of sort of linkage between the programs here, for instance, the Federal Aviation Administration, that's local airport funding. Federal Highway Administration, you might think of just repaving or new highways. Well, that's also with the release today, just the release today of the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Grant Program. Also Maritime Administration, ports, port safety, changing your port from, you know, from heavy diesel to low emissions. So all types of different programs, and sort of the blending of components and from the federal administration, their desires, their priorities, blending it within their grant programs. Additionally, you know, you're seeing sort of with that blending, you're seeing federal agencies work with one another unlike before with this funding, all of this funding. For example, the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, that's US DOE and US Department of Transportation coming together, you know, and offering guidance, support, and along with funding related to, you know, something around say electric vehicles or electric or alternative fuel infrastructure. Next slide. So here, just wanted to touch on some other items. So beyond just new funding, there is an expansion of existing funding. Here, just considering the dollar amounts involved, just want to hit on the RAISE application, which just closed, year one just closed, and the addition of $15 billion for that. This RAISE application or program used to be the BILD or the Tiger program, if you've had some transportation background. And like I was sharing within that program, so an increase or an expansion of the program of $15 billion, but additionally, you have the set aside amounts for rural in that 40%, and then set aside another set aside just for areas of persistent poverty and historically disadvantaged communities. And typically within those grant programs, just so you know, you're like, well, I don't know if I'm one of those areas. Typically within the grant programs, they'll provide you information, you know, some type of mapping or other information so you'll know if you fall into one of those areas. But typically rural means anything under 50,000 in population. Additionally, there's also the resurrection of programs within this bipartisan infrastructure law. The energy efficiency and conservation block grant. That was an old ARPA program that had always been on the books, but had never been funded. But with the BIL, they've provided additional funding. And that is something, again, to show that formulaic piece that we mentioned before. It's not only going out to states, but it's going out to local communities as well. Next slide, please. And then here, just again, around that expansion of existing programs, both the carbon reduction plan and then the surface transportation block grants, both of these just showing that these already had sort of an allocated pass through to local units of government, but they've increased or the requirement has increased. You know, just because the funding may have increased, it doesn't mean that the states just get that additional funding. It is going to be passed through to you all, that or to local units of government. The increase in that funding then is being passed on to the increased requirement for the state to pass on to you. Next slide, please. And then lastly, just wanted to provide sort of a list, not a full list of all the competitive programs that are out there. Some of these are will be released or have been released. And like I said, like the mega projects, those actually just got awarded. Some awards just went out for that one at the bottom there. Safe Streets and Roads for All, that's an upcoming first year of funding is upcoming for that one. The Strengthening Mobility and Revolutionizing Transportation Grant Program, that just year one just passed on that as well. So again, sort of a mix of competitive programs that are out there, either in year one or year one just got awarded or just closed. But just know, again, cannot stress enough that there is a ton of funding out there still over the next 5 years with the BIL specifically, and that you'll have a great opportunity to, in the next slides, to think about your planning and prepping to apply, and then going forth and actually applying. Next slide. I think this is, yep. So transitioning over to Matt. Matt?
Great, thanks, Jason. So a couple, key takeaways. You have not missed out on the IIJA. We're still very much in the infancy of the program. Year 3 is actually the high watermark for the program. And do not convince yourself that your organization, your jurisdiction will not be successful. As I've been interacting with clients and going to conferences, I hear again and again, we're too small. We don't have the right demographics. We don't have the right staff, this, that, and the other thing. And people are already convincing themselves that they're not going to be successful with the IIJA. And we're only in really year 1. For the last 3 years, most of you have not been most of you have been managing formulaic funds. You've been managing, CARES Act, coronavirus relief funds. You've been managing ARPA, state and local fiscal recovery funds. There's very much been a focus on grants compliance over the last several years, and not so much on grants research and pursuance. So organizations are having to pivot very quickly from the compliance environment to the grant research and pursuance environment. Grants is less about grant writing and more about process. And I'll go into this over the next several slides. I'd like people to think about grants management more like their procurement shops or their HR shops. Yes, you have a procurement specialist who knows the procurement process, but when they're actually looking for the technical information about a procurement, they reach out to a subject matter expert to get that information. Same thing if HR is putting together a job description. Yes, there's an HR specialist, but they reach out to the technical expert. And grants, should very much be like that you have a dedicated grant professional, you have a grants administrator, but that person knows the process, is not expected to be the writer, and really has good working relationships with all the various technical leads to pull the content into these applications. So, step 1, honest self-assessment. Where are you? Many of you in the survey, thought you were, pretty well positioned. Know what you're doing about pursuing these grants. That's great. Is that you as an individual or you as an organization? So look at your capacity. Are you decentralized? Are you a hybrid? Are you centralized? Do you have matching funds? Do you have the proper support from legal and accounting and everywhere, everybody else you're going to need to actually, get these grant applications submitted, and then ultimately administered on the post end or on the back end. Also, what sort of partnerships and intergovernmental relationships you have. A lot of these convening organizations, went virtual during COVID. Have these relationships died? Do you need to, put some energy into reestablishing some of these relationships? As many of you know, sometimes, local government's not eligible and a nonprofit is, or sometimes, education is eligible, but it's only K-12 and not higher education. So having really strong partnerships and intergovernmental relationships is going to open up a lot of doors from an allowability perspective. Next slide. I'm not, I want these slides to be a resource for you and to get people thinking critically about themselves and about their organization. So I'm not going to go through each and every item, but on this slide, the one that really, resonates with me or really pops off is culture and climate. Does your organization have a culture and climate where grants are important, that people are excited about grants? Or is it an environment where, grants are just sort of an expectation, it's a other duty is assigned, they're really viewed as just more work on somebody's plate who's already very busy? I've worked in both types of organizations. One where, grants and third-party resources were critical. And every time an application was submitted or a grant was won or a milestone, these things were celebrated within our organization. And everybody knew, to take the necessary time to invest in grants. And I've worked in organizations where, there's no such thing as a good federal grant coming out of Washington, D.C. and, we'll only apply if we have to. So, take stock of that. And if it's within your realm, really try to influence that culture and climate within your organization. Next slide. So building internal capacity, obviously there's a structure. You need to have a grants office. You need to have coordinated approach. There needs to be a reporting transparency, all the good things on this slide. But, the key takeaway is remove the chaos from the process. Each and every time you see a notice of funding availability, each and every time you go to develop a grant application, each and every time you go to complete a quarterly report, it can't be a fire drill. That's just not sustainable. When you, and we've all been there, where our leader, goes to a conference, goes to a meeting, comes back and says, hey, I just heard about this grant, let's go after it. And you look at it and the grant is due in, 10 days, you have to drop everything, try to scramble to get a grant application across the finish line. That's not successful. You really need to, be doing research and pursuance, finding out about funding opportunities as far out as possible, have a structured, go, no-go process. So the organization as a whole is making a decision about whether to pursue, and really have, formal policies and procedures, not because somebody's telling you to, not because, the federal government from a 2 CFR 200 perspective, but really to take the chaos, out of the process. And that would be my key takeaway. We keep an internal tracker of upcoming grant application due dates for IIJA and IRA. There's currently 86 upcoming due dates, and that's just for the programs that have been released to date. If you don't have a structured process to look at those funding opportunities, vet the opportunities, make a go, no go, and you're just scrambling, very reactionary to each and every one, it's just going to be chaos and you're not going to be successful over the next, still 4 years we have left with IIJA. Next slide. So this just goes into a little bit deeper, what I just discussed, but, look at, what you need to, be successful. Do you need a technology solution for doing grant research and pursuance? There's very inexpensive solutions like an instrumental, which is, primarily for the nonprofit. There are more expensive solutions like an eCivis. There are, Cadillac solutions like a, Salesforce. Do you need something like that to be successful? Do you need to have, staff, in National Grants Management Association or GPA or the Native American Finance Officers Association, NAFOA, what professional organizations and memberships, what do you need from a certification and training? I'm a certified grants management specialist. Will those credentials do your organization well? So just really think through. Right now, again, is just year one of a 5-year program. One of the other items is, establish a grant team. You really need to know, if your local government, what public works is doing versus what public safety is doing. You need to have coordinated approaches. If you're a, higher ed or a nonprofit or a tribal entity, I've been on the other side of it doing federal peer review for 14 years with the Department of Justice. You can tell when a coordinated, well-organized grant application comes across versus when an application was only written by, one component of an organization, or worst case, when you get multiple applications from the same jurisdiction. And unfortunately, that happens more than you would think. Next slide. So build for the future. I started my career in 1994 during the Crime Act, the 100,000 officers on the street. And at that point, I said, we'll never see, these levels of federal funding again. Then 9/11 happened, and I never thought we'd see those levels of federal funding again. And then the housing crisis happened. And that, with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, never thought we'd see those funding levels. And now ARPA and the COVID funding has really, and now into IIJA and IRA has really dwarfed that. So build for the future, use, remaining ARPA resources you have, through revenue loss, through building public sector capacity, use, grants that you receive through the BIL and IRA, whether that be a portion of admin funds, indirect cost recoverables, and really take this opportunity to make these investments in your enterprise going forward. What we have seen is those jurisdictions that did this during the housing crisis, back during ARPA, we're much better prepared going into COVID and are much better situated now going into IIJ and IRA. So think of this as the long game, but really a historic opportunity to, make these investments in your organization going forward. Just an overview of grants management models. Certainly, all of these models work. I would definitely advocate that your organization be moving towards at least a hybrid that has a multi-departmental, multi-agency grants working group, has some sort of IT solution where you can see across the enterprise, has some very strong policies and procedures about coordination and signing off on grant applications. My ultimate recommendation for everybody would be to move to a true centralized approach. I know that takes time. There's a change management component, but ultimately that's where you're going to have the greatest amount of coordination, the greatest amount of leveraging resources, and ultimately the most success. A decentralized model, which many of us have operated in, really inhibits the ability to approach the grants management life cycle holistically. So, the grants accountants doing their thing, the grant program managers doing something else. You're trying to, wrestle with procurement, and it's really just kind of a nightmare. But it can work. But I would definitely encourage people to, start their organization on a pathway towards a hybrid approach. Next slide. So, I'm going to go through some of these slides somewhat rapidly to leave us enough time for Q&A, but, really now's the time to put a plan in place. Next slide. So pre-award grants management approach. You really, as I mentioned, need to be working collaboratively together. You need to, be viewing grants almost like a company would review a request for proposals. You need to have a go, no-go process. You need to make sure that grant opportunities align with your mission and vision. We'll talk a little bit about a grant pursuance matrix. I am a huge advocate of the strategic impact that grants can make to an organization and to a local community. I will also be the first person to say that there are bad grants out there and grants that you should not pursue. And you need to, scrutinize them on the front end. Engage stakeholders in the community. This gets lip service all the time. Yeah. We need to do community planning. We need to do, stakeholder engagement. But these programs and this administration are serious about this. You will see equity and resiliency built into almost every program in IIJA and IRA. And while certainly it's, equity in the traditional sense, it also is, what does equity mean to your community, your organization? It could be, access to affordable healthcare. It could be food deserts. It could be affordable housing. There are other components to equity than just, racial equity. So you really need to engage stakeholders to, come up with those definitions on your own, because they will need to be, the win themes built into all of your grant application. Same thing with resiliency. California, unfortunately, you're dealing with climate resiliency right now, head on. And I send my, best wishes to each of you and your communities as you're dealing with historic snowpacks, and I believe they're calling them, atmospheric rivers. So, climate resiliency is top of mind. But there's also, coming out of COVID, we've done a lot of soul searching about what resiliency means to our local community. Loss of a major employer, loss of a key piece of infrastructure. There's a lot that goes into having, loss of teachers or nursing, key employees into our ecosystems. So really, think through those things, so that you understand what equity and resiliency mean to your community. I see in the chat that there's some conversation about notices of funding availability or notices of funding opportunity. Grants.gov has done a much better job of trying to get federal agencies to put NOFOs in plain English and to establish search criteria where you don't have to go through all of what could be 30, 50, 70 pages in the NOFO. There are also services out there that will distill a NOFO down to a single page or a couple pages. Some of those are in the public domain right now, one of which is the NLC Local Infrastructure Hub, and we will follow up with Amy and provide some of these resources to you, because I understand what it is to get excited about a grant application, take a look at it, and suddenly you have 100 pages of Federal Register notice to read through to even understand the next steps. Next slide. Establish an intelligent network. Again, you can't be on every meeting. You can't subscribe to every email list service. So have key stakeholders, key individuals that you share opportunities with. If a funding opportunity, if your organization is not eligible, reach out to a neighbor organization, have those relationships. It's really going to, make you aware of programs that you otherwise might not know of. One of the things we're really seeing now is a huge involvement of the philanthropic community. Right now, the philanthropic community sees real alignment between their mission and these federal programs. So real alignment with equity and resiliency. So they are investing lots of money in training, capacity development, but also providing matching funds and their own companion grant programs. So if you've really just been focused on direct federal, state pass-through type funding, really look out, to the philanthropic community right now, because they have hundreds of millions at play right now with IIJA and IRA. Keep, grant planning continued. One of the items I'll just touch on this, quickly is this whole idea of capital stack. We've all been in a situation where we're trying to accomplish a project. The project's going to be $5 million. We find a grant that maybe is $1 million. That's not enough to get the project started. So the project and the grant die on the vine. Really think through capital stacks. Think through how you can leverage, bonding proceeds, general fund revenues, a state pass-through, some tax credits from IRA, a couple grants, to really put together the puzzle piece and really put together a capital stack that will get some of these projects off the ground, probably for the first time in recent history. National League of Cities, U.S. Conference of Mayors, Results for America, through their local infrastructure hub, are really putting lots of material out there around innovative approaches to budgeting and developing capital stacks. Because now with so much funding, whether it be ARPA with revenue loss, and then some IIJA and IRA and some bond proceeds, you're really able to put together a capital stack, like no time that we've seen recently. Next slide. Again, track funding opportunities. We can talk about grants.gov. We can talk about some other services. Really, keep track of a grantor's funding rhythm. So lots of jurisdictions were not ready this year for, raise grants or some of the other very early federal funding opportunities. But make a note, know that next year at this time, those same funding opportunities you've missed out on will be posted by the federal grantor. Also, document the reasons why you didn't apply. You didn't have a, viable project. You didn't have the match. You didn't have, staff capacity. You needed a partner, whatever those cases, don't let that creep up on you again next year. Be, working through those issues now, knowing that those same programs will be announced about the same time next year. Talked a little bit about having a formalized go no-go process. Everybody talks about the budget impacts of a grant, and they talk about I applied for a grant, it was $1 million, the budget is this, I have this much for personnel, I have this much for salary and ERE. The financial impact of a grant really starts at the time you make a go no-go decision. Before that grant is applied for, you are incurring financial obligations to your organization. You're taking FTEs and you're putting their time. You might be partnered with a consultant. You're paying the consultant fees. So you really need to have a formalized decision criteria to make go no-go decisions going forward. And look at the compliance requirements on the back end. Look about the federal flow down red tape. Look at the program holistically before you start the application, not once you've already invested time, or even worse, once you've received the grant and you're reading the special conditions for the first time. Just grant application development. Don't treat every grant application as if it's a brand new activity. Maintain a library of prior responses. Do not reinvent the wheel, especially with these programs that are more technical in nature. You have data points, you have information on your infrastructure, you have executive summaries. Leverage that same part of grant applications again and again. and also bring as many people to the table as possible during the application process. You show that coordination, but they also, each bring a unique value to the table. One of the things we always advocate for is when you're unsuccessful, always ask for a debriefing, ask for a FOIA request to find out why you weren't funded. It might take a while to get through the federal bureaucracy, but they do have a requirement ultimately to provide you with that. And it's incredibly helpful to know if, you didn't win because there were set-asides or there was geographic equity or you picked the wrong project. So, whenever possible, go through that process to get a debrief. Next slide. This is all pretty self-explanatory, but again, equity, resiliency, community engagement, using data. These are all things we're seeing are critical to the IIJA and IRA funding. And I just want to skip ahead to the next slide. This is the grant pursuance matrix that will be sending out a version. Some of these items might not make sense for your jurisdiction. Others will. Feel free to alter this, tailor it to your jurisdiction, but have something like this again to take the chaos out of the grant application process. Work smarter, not harder. There are shortcuts. Go ahead and next slide. What we're seeing right now is everything we once knew about federal grants is kind of thrown out the window. Using federal funds to match other federal funds. Historically, outside of community development block grants, you could never do that. We have that opportunity now with ARPA through revenue loss. Prohibitions on previously budgeted, prohibitions on supplanting. Within ARPA, we have, National Environmental Policy Act not applying to capital projects under a certain level. We have Davis-Bacon not applying to projects under a certain level. So really think through, what are sort of the administrative easy buttons that you can take advantage of. But also know that improving public sector capacity is a specifically eligible category within ARPA. So, take a look at that and for those that still have some ARPA funding, is this an opportunity to invest in data collection? Is an opportunity to invest in systems, in grant personnel, in all those things that will make you, successful for IIJA and IRA? But also know that even outside of that, improving public sector capacity, there is, administrative cost that are not just limited to the state and local fiscal recovery fund. There is the ability to charge indirect costs for those that don't have a negotiated indirect cost rate. You can always use the de minimis 10%. So there's really just a lot of tools at your disposal that historically have not been there. Next slide. So here is how I would recommend using ARPA funds or other available resources to really prepare yourself for IIJ and IRA. Start that movement from a decentralized to a hybrid to a more centralized grants management environment. Hire and train staff focusing on grant research and pursuance. We made lots of investments in compliance and reporting, but that grant research is going to be critical over the next 5 to 6 years. Look at ESG, governance and compliance, and minority and disabled and women-owned business set-asides, and environmental and sustainability issues, and those things. They all resonate with the current administration, and they will all make you more successful going after IIJ and IRA funds. Don't just dust off capital improvement plans and look at unfunded projects. really look at, do you need to do new studies, new plans? Do you need to get away from just repairing and replacing the old? Or can you really look at, implementing sustainability and expansion of resources going forward? Next slide. Environmental coordination is key. Yes, there will still be a significant amount of money going through the state. Build local coalitions, be talking to state officials. The fact that you're interacting with OPR here and you're participating on this webinar is a great first step. But know that there's going to be pass-through funding coming through the state. There's going to be direct funding. There's going to be formulaic dollars that come to counties and cities that they will have to pass through. There will be philanthropic opportunities. So you really need to be casting a very wide net and having as broad a coalition as possible. Next slide. And just to reinforce, thank you to everyone who participated in last week's Title VI webinar. We did that because equity is more than just a talking point. To this administration, to these programs, they had every single recipient of ARPA, coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery. So every state, county, major metro, but even non-entitlement units of local government who traditionally have not been direct recipients of federal funds sign a Title VI Civil Rights Act assurance to show you how important it is to them. And as mentioned previously, you will see equity and resiliency through all of these programs. So invest the time now to really prepare your organization to be successful going forward. And with that, I know I went a little long, but we'll open it up for some questions.
Please feel free to ask any questions through our chats, or you can also raise your hands and we can unmute you if you have any questions. So again, all of the recordings will be available on the OPR site. We will also be sharing a link to where that will be through email after this as well. If you don't have that, so should be getting the follow-up email with the slides as well as those links. And so I think we've answered all of the questions that have come in through the chat so far. But if we didn't answer your question or if you have something new, please feel free to enter that now into the chat. And I do see 2 people with their hands raised. So maybe we start with Sarah Nelson. I think we'll try to unmute you.
Hi, I just have a question. I didn't know that there was a webinar before this. I thought this was the first one. If we were not in the first one, would we still have access to it in the links and the slides that you're going to send by email?
Yes, so the first webinar that we had last week on Title VI Civil Rights Compliance, we have also recorded that. And so that recording will be also posted on the OPR YouTube page with the links on the Federal Grant Resources page as well. So you'll get the link to where that will be posted. I can't say exactly when it will be uploaded, but it will be as soon as we can get it up there online. So thank you.
Thank you.
And then I see another question here in the chat from Lara Delaney. What are some of the best technology tools for managing grants across a large organization?
Sure. So great question. There are, really, at least 3 buckets of tools. So one are, bolt-on modules that go onto your existing accounting system. Those solutions are really nothing more than a data repository. They're a place for you to, save off CFDA numbers and award amounts. There are enterprise-wide grants management solutions, so purpose-built grants management solutions, which is really what I would advocate. And they are, products like IntelliGrants, AmpliFund, WiseHive, eCivis, Dulles Web Grants. The National Grants Management Association just recently did a session on technology solutions, which is on their website, which would be a great place to take a look at some of those products. And then the third is really, a homegrown, process building on a CRM solution or a Salesforce solution, which can be, incredibly powerful, customizable. My only cautionary note is you need to be a very mature organization that has done, requirements gathering and committed to kind of the IT development process. But I'm a big, I don't work for a grant technology firm, but I'm a big fan and advocate for using those solutions.
Great. And I saw another question here, people interested in hearing from the attendees here. If you're able to enter in the chat where you feel you would need the most support to effectively access these public resources, what phase. So maybe people can submit some answers to that. And then another question for Matt on enterprise management solutions examples. If you just maybe, I guess, name some of those examples that you had named, maybe we can enter those in the chat. And then I see a hand raised from Matt Roast.
Hi, it's Mark Roost.
Mark, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. It's Dutch. And there's two things I'm looking at. One is during the infrastructure discussion, the previous speaker, there's a section on alternative technologies. And I happen to be deeply immersed in those. And in terms of construction, there are two key ones which can slash the cost of building, especially things like bridges or, but basically any kind of surface. And it isn't just the cost reduction, but it's also cutting the levelized cost by not only reducing the upfront cost, but by hugely lengthening the service life, reduces the levelized cost of a unit of service. And these are on an ultra high performance concrete, which was developed over a period of 25 years, about 30 years ago, which has been used all over the world. And it's 5 times the performance of ordinary concrete. And it uses desert sand instead of river sand, which is becoming scarce because of the use of concrete, or its use in concrete. And it's ductile. You can make it thinner. It's ductile. And like they talked about repair. There was a workshop I went to where they—
Sorry, Mark, I hate to interrupt, but we do have very limited time. Do you have a specific question for our presenters?
Okay, yeah. A very specific question is, how can a small group, not a city, just as basically there's a family, there's a team, two people in Germany and Denmark and a family in Texas, but they've got a technology that can totally transform the infrastructure program and get 5 times or 4 times more use out of it. So how can people like that get connected to people who can fund them and do the work of the kind of work you're talking about today, so that these technologies can go forward? And then on my part, I'm working with energy technologies, same thing, totally revolutionary, but there's 2 people working on something, and we're living on Social Security. But we should be able, because our technologies are so important, we should be able to cut through all the barriers to entry and actually rise to the fore. And so I'm looking for ways to do that.
So, there's a lot to unpack there, but very quickly, those technology solutions, those organizations need to get on cooperative purchasing programs. So you could have the best technology out there, but if state and local government cannot procure those technologies, they're a non-starter. So there are cooperative purchasing programs, whether that be NASPO, which is the National Association of State Procurement Officials, obviously the GSA, Houston, Galveston, there are a host of them across the country. The best thing you can do for those firms, for your organization, for the technology, is to work through the cooperative purchasing program so that jurisdictions can access your products and do it compliantly.
Thank you. Thank you. Is there a list of those organizations? You got 3 off the top of your head. Is there a list of those organizations anywhere?
I was just looking at them yesterday, just doing a simple Google search. So if you just put in, federal cooperative purchasing, it'll come up pretty quickly.
Thank you very much. I'll go write that down.
Yep.
Great. And we are at time. So again, I want to thank everybody for joining here today. I think we're going to close things off. And again, we will be sending out a follow-up email with some of this information as well, including a post-training survey we hope you will all take. And we hope to see you at one of our future trainings coming up throughout the month of March. So thank you, everyone.